I'd like to welcome everyone here today to the Fall Honors Lecture Series on the Power of Place. My name is Dr. Philip Phillips, and I'm the Associate Dean of the University Honors College. And it is my pleasure to welcome our speaker today. Dr. Ron Turner is a nationally recognized speaker on prison inmates' religious rights. This year alone, he has led workshops on the topic in Colorado, New Jersey, New York, and Washington State. He practiced law for over 20 years in Nashville before becoming an assistant professor of criminal justice at Cumberland University. From 2007 to 2013, he was director of religious and volunteer services for the Tennessee Department of Correction. Dr. Turner earned his law degree and his master's degree in theological studies from Vanderbilt University. In 2008, he received his PhD in public administration from Tennessee State University, where his dissertation was on religion in prison. The topic of his presentation today is Supermax Prisons, the Good, the Bad, the Ugly. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Turner to MTSU.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean. I am honored to be here with honors students. If you can't hear me in the back at any time, please raise your hand. They have a mic here, but it's for the tape as opposed to the audio in the room. I've got a good connection with MTSU. My younger son, got his bachelor's here in 2006 in business administration. And then in 2008, we had a big event in the United States. Anybody remember what happened in 2008? They had a very serious recession. The bottom fell out of the stock market and the economy. And he lost his job, and he came back to MTSU, and he got a second bachelor's in concrete management. Now and he got a great job after that, by the way, and he's doing very, very well in Kentucky. The reason I share that story with you is not only to show my link to MTSU, but kind of as a real-life suggestion that keep your options open, stay flexible. The fact that I'm here talking about prisons, if someone had told me that when I was in undergraduate school majoring in psychology, I would have absolutely been amazed. I'm going to get into some things that are a little maybe surprising to you. When I first heard the overall topic was the power of place, I thought, well, I'll just come and I'll talk about prison. And I'll give you an overview of the history of prisons and why we lock people up and all the statistics and et cetera, et cetera. And that would be a good general introduction. But as honors students, I decided I'm going to challenge you a little bit more. Do I have any criminal justice majors in here? Has anybody taken any criminal justice classes as an elective? That's actually good because you're starting with a clean slate. I want to start with a graph. Statistics can be very boring, but this is a graph that shows the number of people incarcerated in the United States, locked up in prisons and jails from 1920 to 2006. And if you start in 1920 and come over to about 1980, it was a fairly level line. What happened in 1980 then? Straight up. Now, if the graph continued after 2006, it would go up to about 2011 and then level off, and it actually has come down just a little bit the last 2 years. But I want you to absorb this. The United States has more people locked up in prisons and jails than any other country in the world. Today we have about 2.2 million people locked up. Not only do we have more people locked up, we have more people per capita locked up. What does that mean? Per capita would mean what? Anybody? Yeah?
A percentage, not just the most, but the most compared to population.
That's right, the most compared to population. So we have more people. You might say, well, a smaller country might have more people per capita. We have more people per capita. Okay, we're number one. Now, the interesting thing is what happened. Why did this happen right here? Why did we have this big change? Maybe I'll be better off just pointing with my finger. In 1980. What happened in 1980 in the United States?
Drug wars.
Say again?
Drug wars.
The drug war. War on drugs caused a whole lot of people to get locked up. People who used to possess just a little bit of pot, now all of a sudden they were in prison. It was a felony. 3 strikes and you're out, sentencing guidelines and so forth. Who was elected president in 1980?
Reagan.
Ronald Reagan. Good liberal, right? No, he's the darling of the conservatives. Well, the conservative political mood of the country was another reason we started locking lots of people up. Tough on crime. We've had it with all this crime, okay? There was one other thing that happened in the 70s and 80s, actually. Do you have any psychology majors? Have you heard the word deinstitutionalization? Deinstitutionalization of mentally ill people, okay? Why did this happen in 1980? The conservative mood in the 1980s, the war on drugs, and deinstitutionalization. That means people are getting out of institutions. We started closing our mental hospitals because the thinking was that people would be better out in the community, not in big mental hospitals, in smaller places, where their families could take care of them and so forth. What happened to a lot of those people who were mentally ill, and for years they've been locked in mental hospitals? When they're let out, where did a lot of them end up? On the street. That's why homelessness is such a big problem. Okay, these are 3 reasons that the graph looks the way it does. From 1980 until today, the total population of our prisons and jails has gone from about 600,000 to 2.2 million. Okay. So the next question, what were the consequences of that kind of prison growth? Within the prison, all of a sudden you had serious overcrowding. All of a sudden in the 80s, the prisons were so overcrowded that a lot of inmates around the country filed lawsuits saying that it was unconstitutional. The Tennessee prison system was actually under the control of the federal court for about 15 years until we could get some new prisons built. Inmates were 3 or 4 to a cell. They were sleeping in gymnasiums. They were sleeping in hallways, you name it, because there was this huge influx of people coming into the prison. Gangs and drugs, okay? Now, a lot of guys would come, it's men and women. About 90% of the people who are locked in prison are male, about 10% are female. That's beginning to change. One of the changes that's happening in our prison system is that more and more women are now being arrested and locked up, and they're being arrested for more violent crimes than they used to in the old days. But if I say guys, the reason I do is because the majority of them are male. A lot of people end up in prison, this was starting in the 70s and 80s, and it certainly continues today, that were members of gangs on the street. Well, when they get to prison, guess what? Who are they going to be pals with? The gang members that they were in the gang on the street, okay? Drugs, okay? Can you get drugs in prison? Unfortunately, you can. One of the big surprises I had when I first started working in prisons, I had never been in a prison until 2000, and I'll tell you more about the story about that. I was leaving law practice, and I was transitioning into college teaching, and I knew I was going to be teaching criminal justice, so I wanted some real life experience in prison. So the summer of 2000, I was finishing up my master's in divinity school, and my field education placement from divinity school was at Riverbend Prison. Anybody ever heard of Riverbend? Riverbend Prison is a maximum security prison in Nashville. It's where Tennessee's death row is. Anyway, I was there full-time, 40 hours a week for about 10 or 11 weeks in the summer of 2000. So that's why I saw firsthand what was going on. Drugs are certainly not legal in prison, but they have a way of getting in. That led to a lot of violence. You've got overcrowded, you've got people who belong to gangs, you've got misuse of drugs and so forth. So in the early 80s, the level of violence within our prisons really started to increase. Have you heard the name Attica? Anybody ever heard of Attica? What's Attica? Do you remember?
No, it's in New York.
New York.
Maximum security prison, I believe.
Maximum security prison. What happened at Attica?
A lot of extreme violence against inmates.
Well, it was a serious riot, and it was way back in 1971. The inmates actually took over the prison for about 4 days. And the National Guard came in, and they had helicopters over, and there's a whole special on this so that you can see it. It's really well done. Anyway, it got the attention of the nation because some inmates were killed, some correctional officers were killed. And if I use the term CO, that stands for correctional officer. It's what you would call a guard, but in prison they call them COs. A lot of COs were killed as well. So by the early 80s, we had some serious problems in our prisons, primarily relating to violence. So what to do? What to do? We had inmates killing other inmates. We had to do something. So in 1984, we came up with a new approach, or they came up with a new approach. I certainly wasn't involved in it. In Marion, Illinois, there was a federal prison in Marion, Illinois, that just like Attica way back in '71 had a bad riot. The federal prison in Marion had a bad riot as well. And they said, we've had it. We're going to come up with a new approach. And I want to suggest, I don't have a slide that does this, but if you have a piece of paper, draw a circle about 4 inches in diameter, okay? And then go in about 1 inch and draw another circle. So you've got a small circle and a big circle. And then draw one more circle in the middle of that. So you've got 3 circles, okay? Now, I want you to label these. In the middle circle, put a C, and in the next circle going out, put a B, and in the next circle going out, put an A. Well, the whole big circle, what we call A, the great big circle, represents the prison in Marion, okay? And they were having a riot, and there were inmates killing other inmates and so forth, and they said, we've got to do something else. So they created a prison within the prison, and that was Circle B. And that we're going to call the maximum security prison. In the maximum security prison, inmates didn't have as much freedom as they did in Circle A. They were more restricted, okay? And I'm going to give you the details on how restricted they were in just a minute. Well, guess what happened? Some of the inmates in the maximum security prison in Circle B also found ways to kill each other. There's bad stuff going on. So what did the prison officials do? They said, we're going to create a circle within the circle that's within the circle. And that's what C is, and that's called Supermax. Everybody with me? Okay. Supermax is a housing unit within the max unit, A, B, and C. Okay? So the question is, what does Supermax look like? In other words, how is C different than B and A? Well, I think the best way to describe Supermax is for me to tell you what Max looks like. Okay? Maximum security, I saw for the first time that summer of 2000 when I was working out at Riverbend. Riverbend Maximum Security Institution is the name of the prison. And about half of that prison would be maximum security, and the other half would be medium security. They didn't have any kind of Supermax. As far as I know, we don't have any Supermax prisons in Tennessee. I retired from the Department of Correction about 2 years ago, so I've lost contact. Okay, this isn't always public information, but when I retired, there were no Supermax prisons in Tennessee. About 30 states have them. Okay. The best way for me to describe what Supermax looks like is to describe maximum security. And this is what I saw firsthand when I was working that summer of 2000. When you're locked in maximum security, and this is going to be summarized on the next slide, by the way, so you don't have to write all this down. You're locked in your cell 23 out of 24 hours a day. This cell is 6 feet by 9 feet, so it'd be much smaller than this stage, okay? You get out of your cell 1 hour a day to take exercise, and they have a fenced-in area which is also fenced on the top. It's kind of like a cage where you can go out and get fresh air and you see the grass and the sky, and you can get exercise and so forth, okay? You are given your meals inside your cell. They have a little flap. You have a metal door on your cell with a long window about 3 inches wide. And then there's a flap called a pie flap, and that's where an officer will come by and hand you your meals 3 times a day. You get the same food that everybody else in the whole prison gets. And it's not that bad. You also have a window, so you can look outside. It's a long, narrow window, about 4 inches by 24 inches high. You can make phone calls. Prison inmates who behave themselves are allowed to make phone calls. The state, long distance that's paid for by the person that you're calling, okay? They can't make local calls. And those are limited to a certain number of minutes and a certain number of calls a week, and they're all monitored. You get mail. You can have radio or TV. A lot of people say, wait a minute, what do you mean? Sitting there in prison watching TV, that's crazy. Well, folks, they have to buy their own TV set, by the way. And it can't be a big screen. It's limited to one particular type of TV. And the inmate either has to have the money to pay for it, or their family gets it, or sometimes churches give them. Imagine living in a cell 6 feet by 9 feet, 23 hours a day out of every 24, 7 days a week. And the biggest surprise I had was a lot of the inmates who lived like that looked just like you all. Some of them were 20 years old, 21 years old. They had been big tough guys out on the street. Bad, okay? And they had done some bad stuff. They had ended up in a maximum security prison. Can you imagine, and with 25, 30-year sentences, life sentences, can you imagine living like that without a radio or a TV? You'd go crazy. So I'm not defending any of the crime that they commit, but the fact that we allow them to have TV in prison, I think that's just kind of humane, okay? That's what maximum security looks like. Single cell, you're in there by yourself, 23 hours a day, hour per day exercise outside, phone privileges, visitors, you can't have visitors, they can't come see you right there at your door. You have to go to a little special little visiting area and you see them through a glass, but you can have visitors. Regular meals, shower 3 times a week, 5-minute shower 3 times a week, okay? And they do have radio and TV. The best way to understand Supermax, which was created, remember we had people who were living in this kind of situation who still couldn't behave themselves. They would find some way to kill another inmate, and they're very ingenious. So they developed Supermax. Here's what Supermax looks like. The goal of Supermax is minimal human contact. What's the word minimal mean? Small, as little as possible. Minimal sensory stimulation. What is sensory stimulation? Outside influences, yeah, like sound, light, color, music, etc. The lights are kept on 24 hours a day. Sometimes they're dimmed a little bit, but the lights are on 24 hours a day. 4 hours per week of exercise, not 1 a day. And the exercise is inside. In Supermax, they don't take you outside to exercise, they'll take you to another, and you're in this cell about 6 by 9, with no windows, by the way. For your exercise, they take you to an inside exercise area. Sometimes you can look up and see the sky, sometimes you can't. Sometimes it depends on the prison. There are inmates who've been in Supermax for years who've never seen a blade of grass or the sky, or a bird or anything like that. No phone privileges, no visitors, no radio or TV, and some of them you're completely naked and have no blankets at first. Some Supermax prisons have a level system so that when you first get there, you have to kind of prove yourself by following all the regulations. And if you follow the regulations, then you get some privileges, like being able to wear clothes. Limited toilet paper at first. In some Supermax prisons, you're given a very small number of sheets of toilet paper. And I'm saying some because that doesn't apply to all of them. And Nutriloaf meals. You remember, what do the inmates in maximum security eat? What did I say? Same thing as everybody else. And it's pretty decent food. It really, you know, maybe a hamburger and some mashed potatoes and sometimes a cookie for dessert. You know, they've got minimum nutritional requirements that they have to meet. What does Nutriloaf sound like? Does that sound appetizing to anybody? Mm-mm. The name alone sounds unappetizing, doesn't it? One way inmates are punished And I don't think I've ever seen it in Tennessee, but I know for a fact that they have it in some other prisons, is that if you really misbehave, one thing they will do is put you on Nutriloaf. And that means they take a blender and they put the basic ingredients of a meal into the blender and they blend it up and they put it in a loaf pan, and that's what they'll serve to you. And it's not like hamburger meat and mashed potatoes and a little seasoning and so forth. Usually it's oatmeal without any seasoning. Pretty bland stuff. Okay? I wish you could see your faces. I think I have your attention now. Had anybody ever heard of Supermax? You had? Wow. Well, I'm glad to know that you had, because when I first heard about it, it blew my mind. Anyway, let's talk about, this is what we're going to be considering for the rest of this hour. Today, about 82,000 inmates are in Supermax around the country out of 2.2 million. That's about 3.5%. So you could say, hey, it's the worst of the worst. It's the worst 3.5%. Why worry about it? They should have thought of that before they committed all those bad crimes. That's one approach, isn't it? And it's only 82,000 people out of 2 million. 30 states and the feds have Supermax. Let's talk about the worst of the worst. When it was first designed, Supermax was for the worst of the worst. And I'm going to read I'm going to give you some details from some actual law cases here in a minute. And you're going to see that there's some bad guys in there. That's interesting. I don't know if any women are in Supermax or not. That'd be an interesting question. I need to research that. The problem is, since 1984, as Supermax prisons have proliferated, that means they've grown more and more, and we have them in 30 states, there are a lot of cells that are in Supermax that have to be kept filled. I'll tell you a little secret about prisons. It costs a lot of money to build a cell and have a cell there. The last thing the system wants, the Department of Correction or the legislature wants, is an empty cell, okay? So cells need to be kept full. And if you're the warden of a prison and you've got a couple of cells in your Supermax unit that aren't full, instead of putting the worst of the worst in there, you might put somebody who's not quite the worst of the worst. Another thing, there's a thing called protective custody. Anybody ever heard of protective custody? What's that mean?
It's where you're taken away from gen pop and they guard you 24/7 away from regular contact.
For your own protection. Yeah. Why would they need to do that? What's a classic example of protective custody?
Take threats. So you can get death threats.
Yeah, but some inmates would make death threats against other inmates. Sex offenders, particularly pedophiles, are very often the subject of death threats from other inmates. It's kind of the justice within the prison. Well, to keep the pedophile alive, and we've got an obligation not to let them kill him or him, they put him in Supermax, because it's certainly the most secure, isn't it? Nobody's going to get to him. Well, how would you feel if you were the inmate stuck in Supermax? You haven't done anything, at least you haven't violated any prison rule, and all of a sudden you're there for your own protection. Another thing is racial threats. We have gangs, we have black gangs and white gangs and Hispanic gangs, and boy, they go at it sometimes. So you take some of the leaders of the gangs, and for their own protection, you'll put them in Supermax. You also have a lot of mentally ill inmates. About 60% of all the people in prison, it's estimated, and that's based on some pretty good data, have some type of mental illness before they get there, okay? That can be everything from having a low IQ to being delusional and schizophrenic and depressed and seeing hallucinations and so forth, okay? A lot of these folks who are mentally challenged have trouble in prison following the rules. They get punished. They ultimately get punished by being put in Supermax. Okay. I told you I want to talk a little bit about some real cases. Mr. Silverstein was kept in Supermax for 30 years. From 1983 to 2013, he filed a lawsuit. He said, "This is too much. This is unconstitutional. It's driving me crazy. Something's got to be done." Well, what I didn't tell you was that between 1979 and 1982, Mr. Silverstein killed 4 people in prison. He killed one inmate by strangling him with a cord. He stabbed a correctional officer 69 times with a homemade knife. Another part of the story about Silverstein is that he was a high-ranking official in the Aryan Nation in this particular state. Anybody ever heard of the Aryan Nation? What's the Aryan Nation?
Isn't the white gang in prisons?
White supremacists. Actually, they're not only in prison, they're very popular in prison, but they're outside as well. In this particular state, in the prison system, there were 3 white men, he's white, at the top of the Aryan Nation in this prison system. And they had the power within the Aryan Nation, and they had a lot of inmates who were members of that gang, to say, "We want you to kill so-and-so." And the person in the gang had to do it. Or what would happen to that person? They could get killed, okay? So Silverstein was a bad guy. He had the power to have other people kill people. He had killed people himself. And so he was put in Supermax for 30 years. At the end of the presentation, where I've got the references listed, and you can get these because they'll be available to you, you'll see the Silverstein case. And I would encourage you to read it. You can get these cases. Just Google the name of the case, and there'll be a case number next to it that's in the references, and read them. I know, any pre-law majors in here? Okay, this will be good practice for the pre-law majors. When you read these cases, don't get lost in all the legal gobbledygook, because it's a lot of it. Just read the facts of the case and read what they said. If you try to follow all the legal arguments, that's not why I'm suggesting you do it. That'll be very confusing for you. But it's a fascinating thing. And read the Scarver case and the Gillis case as well. And there are 2 others back there, by the way. The Scarver case is interesting because Mr. Scarver was seriously mentally ill. He was a schizophrenic and delusional. He was on some pretty high-powered psychotropic drugs to deal with that. Unfortunately, the Supermax unit that they put him, and he had killed several inmates in prison too. He was a dangerous mentally ill person. A lot of mentally ill people aren't really that dangerous. They just can't take care of themselves. He was dangerous. He'd killed some people in prison. So they put him in a Supermax unit that didn't have any air conditioning. And in the summertime, I just described it, it doesn't have any windows, okay, no fan, no air conditioning. The case itself talks about it would get to 90 to 100 degrees in his cell. Well, unfortunately, the psychotropic medication he was taking for his schizophrenia and his delusions was made worse by heat. And the prison officials didn't know that. He kept acting crazy. He was hitting his head against the wall, and he was cutting himself, and he would write "help me" in blood on the wall, and it sounds crazy. Well, he did need to be helped, okay? Well, they thought what he needed to be helped was more medicine, so they gave him more medicine. Okay, read that case. That's a fascinating one. The third one I've got up here is the Gillis case, and I want to read, this is some of the language right out of the Gillis case. Gillis was sent to a Supermax prison, and the case doesn't really explain why. I assume he killed another inmate, so they sent him to this prison. And when he got to the Supermax prison, he refused to follow one of their rules. So for breaking that rule, he was put in what they call their behavior modification program. Y'all know the term behavior modification? Yeah, if you want to modify behavior, you take certain steps. You're training a dog, or if you want to modify a human being's behavior. Okay. Let me just read this to you. Mr. Gillis arrived at Supermax in 2002. Within 2 weeks of his arrival, he was placed in the behavior modification program for infraction of a rule. The rule required that inmates sleep with their heads toward the back of the cell where the toilet was. He didn't want to do that, so he slept with his head toward the front. The prison officials argued that compliance with the rule was necessary so that the guards could see his head so they could know what his condition was. And they claimed that the toilets were perfectly clean. Use your own judgment on that. So he was put in, you with me? He was sent to Supermax. He refused to follow their rules, so he's put in their behavior modification program. In stage 1 of the behavior modification program, Gillis was deprived of nearly all human contact and sensory stimuli. He had no property in his cell and no privileges. He was stark naked and had no mattress or other bedding. He slept naked on the concrete floor or on the concrete slab that serves as the bed. He tried to sleep next to a heat vent, but the air from the vent was cool. He says he was so cold that he had to walk around his cell 14 hours a day trying to stay warm. He was fed Nutriloaf, basically a ground-up block of food. He was denied mail, visitors, phone privileges, canteen items, writing materials, and use of the law library. There's a dispute over the amount of toilet paper he had. He says he received it only on 5 occasions during the entire time he was in this program, and then it was 4 squares at a time. The prison officials say he received toilet paper whenever he asked for it. The program had an adverse effect on Gillis's mental stability. He heard voices telling him that these people are trying to kill you. He suffered panic attacks with palpitations, heart palpitations, shortness of breath, and a feeling that he was going to die. He became suicidal. He inflicted wounds on his body and wrote the words, "Help me," in blood on the walls of his cell. Gillis defines this program as a punitive measure unrelated to the conduct the officials are trying to change. What was the conduct they were trying to change? Change the way he slept on the cot. Does this sound just a little over the top for a guy who's sleeping the wrong way on his bed? That's your decision, but I just throw it out there. He said this is punitive and not related to making me change my the way I'm going to sleep. And the prison officials said that the program was not punitive. It was merely an attempt to convince him to conform his behavior to the rules. Okay. This court found in favor of the prison. And that's going to raise some questions, and you'll say, how could that happen? We're going to look at 4 perspectives of Supermax. Okay? The legal perspective, the psychological, the philosophical, and the theological. I've hit you with a lot of stuff, and I know it's hard to absorb all this stuff. Okay? But now I want you to step back from it just a little bit and think about it from a legal standpoint, a psychological standpoint, a philosophical standpoint, a theological standpoint. There are 2 amendments to the U.S. Constitution that come into play with regard to Supermax. One is the 8th Amendment that says, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Does Supermax sound like it's cruel and unusual to anybody? Sure does to me, okay? The 5th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution says no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Due process of law basically means a fair hearing, okay? Before they lock you up someplace, you have a right to be charged with a crime, and you have the right to be represented by an attorney and have a trial and all this good stuff. That's what due process is. Well, he's being deprived of his liberty, any of these inmates, and therefore due process should come into play. In some situations, particularly in the early days of Supermax, the warden could send an inmate to Supermax without any kind of hearing and for an indefinite period of time. You'd be locked in there, and you go to Max for the same thing. You never know when you're going to get out. It's up to the warden, okay? Now, is Supermax unconstitutional? What I found was that the law is very technical in this area. This was going to be the primary focus of my talk today, and I realized the law is so technical, it would be a challenge for me to do this in a law school, much less undergraduates, okay? So just trust me, some federal trial courts have said, yes, it is unconstitutional. But when the case was then appealed to the courts of appeals, they are looking at it. It's in process. It's being looked at. The Supreme Court, which has the ultimate say-so, has not said yes. The Supreme Court has never said that what I've just described to you constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. Because how can I say this? Whether anything violates the Constitution depends on really two things. What the Constitution says, like the Eighth Amendment says no cruel and unusual punishment, and then what the Supreme Court has said about that, how the court has interpreted that over the last 200 years. And based on the way the Supreme Court has interpreted cruel and unusual punishment, they have not found one of these situations to violate that yet. Okay? Psychological issues. What impact does Supermax have on the inmate? Well, there are many studies, and these are cited in these law cases, that show Supermax exacerbates mental illness. And as I told you, 60% of all inmates are mentally ill when they come into prison. What's the word exacerbates mean? Increases. Makes it worse. If it exacerbates it. In other words, if he's paranoid when he goes in, he's a lot more paranoid after this. And suicidal. And that's not a surprise when you think about it. And Supermax can cause new problems as well, not only make existing problems worse. Philosophical issues. Should we be doing this as a society? Is this the right way for us to treat people? Is it the right thing to do versus the wrong thing to do? When you get into philosophy, anybody taking a philosophy course yet? Any philosophy majors? Yeah. You talk about what's right and wrong, what's moral, okay? How should we act as human beings and as a civilized society? Does the end justify the means? What does that mean? How does that apply to Supermax? Yes?
Is the result, which in this case would be rehabilitation, worth what they do to get there?
Okay, that's a good answer. Does the end justify it? Is it worth putting people through all this to get to rehabilitation? Is rehabilitation really the end that we're trying to get? What's the whole goal of Supermax?
To keep them from harming.
Safety and security. Yeah. Now, unfortunately, you make a very good point. Some people who are locked in Supermax will get out one of these days. When their sentence is up, they're let out. There are a number of prison inmates who stay in maximum security, and that's bad enough. And if they've got a 20-year sentence and they've never earned parole, at the end of 20 years, they have to be released. They've paid their debt to society. Can you imagine living in maximum security, which you saw earlier, one day and getting out into the world the next day? 20 years later, they didn't even have cell phones, okay? So, does the end justify, does all this that we've talked about justify the goal of keeping prisons safe? Theological questions, and I know this is a state university, so I don't want to merge, church and state here, but the first question you always ask from a theological standpoint is there a God? And I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. I'm going to guess that the majority of you believe in God. The question is, where is God in all this? Is that a realistic question? I think that's a good question to ask. And what I'm asking is, what do you think? I don't want to know what your minister says, and I don't want to know what your parents have taught you. I want to know what you think from a theological standpoint. Where is God in all this? Future action. What can you do? Maybe you'll say, there's not a thing I can do, okay? I was amazed at how many of you raised your hand. Maybe you had heard about Supermax because you were coming to this lecture. But if you have heard about Supermax before, the question is, maybe you think it's fine, it's not my business, it's not my problem. But as an educated, participating member of society, you all are going to be leaders in just a few years. The question is, now that you have this knowledge about Supermax, what do you do with it? Knowledge is power. I'm going to suggest that you take an elective. Okay, a lot of you are juniors and seniors, and I know that, and you may be running out of electives. But consider taking Introduction to Criminal Justice. It won't be the toughest academic course you've ever taken, but you'll sure learn a lot of stuff. This is the tip of the iceberg. Or if you can, take a course in corrections. I haven't looked at the catalog. I'm sure that in criminal justice they've got these classes. If you take a class in corrections, and the intro might be a prerequisite to it, you'll learn a whole lot about the prison system. Okay? Learn as much as you can about the prison system. It's a huge part of our budget. A lot of states now, one reason we have Supermax, and I'll tell you this, is financial. The cheapest way to deal with these people is to lock them in a cage, lock them in a hole in the ground, okay? You've got one officer who can oversee 30 of them or whatever if they never get out, okay? Talk about it among yourselves. Almost time for some questions. Dostoevsky wrote a classic book called Crime and Punishment. Anybody ever read that? Maybe in high school? If you haven't read it, read it. He said you can judge a society by how well it treats its prisoners. Isn't that, and that's back in the 1800s? I can't remember when he wrote it. Late 17 or early 1800s. You can judge a society by how well it treats its prisoners. I want to suggest a slight modification to that. You can judge a society by how well it treats its worst prisoners. Now, I'll just show you, these are references. These are 3 general references. They're really good articles, and you can get them off the website. These are there's the Gillis case, there's another Hernandez case, there's Scarver, there's Silverstein, and Wilkinson. Okay, so how about some questions or thoughts or comments? Yes?
Is the Supermax the same thing as what's referred to in Washington State as the whole?
I don't know. The whole is a general term that's used to define or to describe any place that a prisoner is put, an inmate is put, for a short period of time as punishment.
Are they used as short term?
Yeah. Historically, the whole was intended to be short term to get an inmate's attention. And it was no windows or doors and bad food and so forth. I hadn't really thought about the relationship between the whole and Supermax. Supermax might be the modern day version of the whole. Most prisons still have a place they call the whole. It's not literally a hole in the ground, but a lot of Supermax prisons are. It does, yeah. And one point I didn't make, when you commit a crime and you have a trial and you're convicted, either by a judge or a jury, they don't send you to Supermax. All they do is find you guilty of murder or whatever, okay? Then you go to the prison, and when you first get to the prison, you go through what they call a classification process. And the prison system decides whether you go to maximum, minimum, medium, or Supermax. And nobody would be put in Supermax the first day they go to prison. The way you get put in Supermax is by violating the rules. And that case about the guy not sleeping with his head at the right end of the cot, that's an extreme case. Most of these folks have done really bad stuff, as I told you, like murder and stabbing other inmates and correctional officers. Some of them are absolutely incorrigible. What's that word mean? Incorrigible? They don't listen to anything. They can't be changed. They can't be fixed. And I'm, you know, from my years, and I've been working in and around the prison system for about 15 years now, there's a certain percentage of inmates who need to be there. I'm not in favor of the death penalty. I'm the first one to say it. But I'm also not in favor of letting some people out. You have life without parole, okay? But, well, I don't want to give you my own thoughts. Maybe you've picked up some of them about Supermax. I want to know what your thoughts are about Supermax. Yes?
There's a large corporation out in Nashville that runs a lot of prison systems. Now, are they involved in any Supermax prisons, or are they just mostly minimum security?
That's Corrections Corporation of America, CCA. I don't know for a fact. My guess is that they don't run any Supermax prisons because the potential liability for them would be too great. It would also, it'd be hard to run a Supermax prison. You know, a private prison company, and they're not the only one in the country, there's several, they're the biggest one, and they run prisons not only in the United States but in some other countries. They sign a contract with the state of Tennessee, state of California, you name it, to come in and manage a prison. And their argument is we can do it more cost effectively than the state can. They still are bound by the Constitution and all of the laws that apply to the state when they're running a prison. But they negotiate the contract, so it's up to CCA to come in and say, hey, we'd like to bid on running this Supermax prison. I don't know Whether they do, I'd be surprised. Yeah.
How's it decided if someone has exhibited good enough behavior to get out of Supermax into maximum security again? Because I mean, you're not really able to do anything. So. Right.
Theoretically, there will be a due process. Remember the Fifth Amendment? There's a due process system set up within the prison so that after a certain period of time, the inmate automatically comes up for a hearing and might even be able to be represented by a lawyer and that kind of thing. From my experience, it's the warden's decision. And you do it by behaving yourself. And one of these cases, I think it was the Scarver case, he was the guy who was the most mentally ill, and he started banging his head on the wall. They wrote him up for banging his head on the wall. They said he's violating the rules. And you just want to go, what can he do? Yeah, good question. Yeah, the short answer is you just behave yourself. Yeah. There was a question back here.
So you said there are no trials involved in sending a prisoner to maximum security or supermax, or there are some?
When they're convicted of their initial crime and sent to prison, the judge at that stage doesn't send them to supermax or even maximum security. They send them to prison, and then the prison system will look at the type of crime they committed and their history and their emotional state and everything else and decide which level to put them in. Once they're in prison, if they violate some of the rules, like kill another inmate, then they're sent to supermax. And the process of making that decision will vary from one state to another. Some states probably protect the due process rights of the inmates better than others. I don't want to give you the impression that there's no due process protection. In some states it might be.
You said that it's the prison systems that decide whether they're in regular security or maximum when they get there. But isn't that a conflict of interest since they're the ones who have to fill the cells?
You know, that's a great question. That's a great question. The people who run the prison system would say, we're the experts and we deal with prison inmates every day, and who else knows better how to determine where a person should be sent? Conflict of interest is, that's a great critical thinking aspect of this. Good question. Yes?
So, for those who are opposed to the supermax for being unconstitutional, what are their proposed solutions for dealing with individuals that are committing crimes like that?
Great question. Great question. One of the general references, it's this one, and the Correctional Law Reporter goes into that a lot. The point that's made by them is usually these people are incorrigible. A certain percentage of them are, okay? The first thing they would say is the folks who are in Supermax because they're mentally ill, get them some mental health stuff. Get them out of Supermax. People who are in there for protective custody, there's got to be a better way to protect them. But the ones who are just, you know, as soon as you let them out, they're going to go murder somebody, they have to be kept secure. But when you look at some of these extreme measures that are imposed on them, it just makes it worse. You know, humiliating someone by not letting them have any clothes, and this includes underwear. Now, the argument in favor of that is, the guy might try to commit suicide and take his shirt and strangle himself. The point they make, to answer your question, is treat them humanely. Let them have a visitor once in a while, even through a glass, okay? Feed them decent food. Let them go outside once in a while, even in a cage. See, there's a lot of things done in Supermax that sound just punitive. We're doing it just to punish them, okay? The arguments that are made is that there's a way to protect society and protect the prison without being that punitive. They also, and there's a great article in this Correctional Reporter about how other countries do it. We're in a small minority. We have more Supermax than anybody. Finland and Scotland are used as examples of where they take people who commit horrible crimes over there, and they're just as bad as people who commit the crimes here, and they treat them very differently. And the longest sentence they have in one of those, and I can't remember which one, is like 18 years. And they don't put them in a supermax setting. They put them, it's like if you treat someone like an animal, they're going to act like an animal. There's bound to be a way you can treat them like a person without jeopardizing your own safety. Yeah. Did I have another question? Yes.
I think I'm confused. So we talked about the maximum security prison and the supermax security prison.
Right.
What does a minimal security look like?
Okay. Good question. Good question. Minimum security prison would be, a lot of them don't even have walls. They look like a college campus where people stay in dorms. Many times the inmates are free to go anywhere on the campus. They've committed a minor crime, and you know, they have lots of privileges. They usually are there for 2 to 5 years. That would be a minimum security. Medium security would get a little more restrictive, where they would have a wall, or some fence. I say walls. Then prisons nowadays have fences, where you would be locked in your housing unit, not necessarily in your cell, but you could get out and talk to the other inmates in your housing unit. You can go to the cafeteria to eat your meals, so you can see all the other inmates. That would be in minimum and medium security. Yeah. Okay.
The illustration you used about the circles, are you kind of saying that a bigger prison may have a supermax within it, or a supermax is usually their own entity?
Excellent question. Excellent question. Both. Some prisons have a supermax unit within the prison. That's how they first started. Nowadays, there are also freestanding prisons that are nothing but supermax. I've heard that in Tennessee, they're thinking about taking one of the housing units at Riverbend, which is maximum security, and converting it to supermax. I don't know whether that's happened or not. This article in the Denver Law Review, The Ninth Circle of Hell, that's a reference to Dante. Dante talks about the circles of hell. You get deeper and deeper and deeper. That's why I had you draw the circles. Yeah. Yes?
Would you know how much each level of security would cost, like the state for all of that?
You know, I'm bad at those numbers. Obviously, supermax is going to be the most expensive, and it goes down. I think it's very expensive. I think, don't hold me to this. It seems to me that in, say, a medium security prison, even that's just, where the security is pretty light, you're looking at about $40,000 a year per inmate. And as you go up to supermax and supermax, you can get up in the $80,000 range. And one reason for that, in max, one of the things that I saw was that when an inmate comes out of his cell in maximum security, 2 officers one is on one arm and one is on the other arm, and they escort him everywhere he goes. They don't just let him have free run of the place. And he's shackled like this, and his feet are shackled and so forth. More questions? Yes.
Would you happen to know the suicide rate in supermax prisons?
Don't know. Don't know. I'm sure it's high. I'm sure it's high, and it's the type of thing that's probably not accurately reported in a lot of states. Many times they'll say an inmate died of natural causes when it was a suicide. Yeah.
You mentioned how other countries have lighter security and more rights for prisoners. Do you know if they have a higher or a lower return rate of people who get out of prison and end up coming back?
Actually, the studies that have been done on, and the word for that's recidivism, the studies that have been done on supermax show that the inmates in supermax don't have a lower recidivism rate, those who do get out. We have a high recidivism rate here, so I'm going to guess that the other countries have a lower one, but I don't know for sure. I see Dean Phillips standing up.
Yes. Please join me.
Okay, thank you, everybody.